Imagine ruling one of the richest and most powerful kingdoms on earth, with an army of workers at your command, limitless stone to quarry, and the ambition to leave behind a monument that would last for eternity. That was the dream of the Old Kingdom pharaohs of Egypt, and it is a dream that turned into one of history's greatest financial disasters. The Great Pyramids at Giza are awe-inspiring today, but behind their massive stone walls is the story of a government that bankrupted. Its self-building monuments so large they crushed the very system that supported them. You think modern debt is bad? Try a pyramid scheme that literally brought down a dynasty, and this is exactly what makes it one of history's dumbest decisions. The Old Kingdom, which flourished around 2700 to 2200 BCE, was the golden age of pyramid building. Pharaohs like Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure ordered gigantic tombs that would demonstrate their divine power and guarantee their passage into the afterlife. On the surface, this made sense. Egypt was wealthy, its agricultural base along the Nile was strong, and the pharaoh was seen not just as a king, but as a living god. When Khufu decided to build the Great Pyramid, there was no question of cost because who dares tell a god they can't afford something? But just because no one said no, didn't mean the treasury could handle it. Building a pyramid wasn't just stacking stones. It was a massive logistical operation that required an endless flow of resources. Limestone had to be quarried, granite had to be brought from hundreds of miles away in Aswan, copper tools had to be produced in massive quantities, and wood for sledges and scaffolding had to be imported from areas far outside Egypt. None of this came free. Every block of stone carved, every tool smelted, and every beam of wood hauled across deserts had a cost that multiplied over decades. The bigger the pyramid, the higher the bill. Then there were the workers. Forget the Hollywood myth of slaves dragging stones under whips. Archaeological evidence shows that the pyramids were built by thousands of laborers who were fed, housed, and rotated in shifts. These warranty-chained captives, they were farmers conscripted during the flood season when the Nile covered their fields. That meant the state had to provide for them while they worked. Bread, beer, meat, clothing, and shelter. Entire villages were constructed to house these workers, feeding tens of thousands of laborers, along with their overseers, priests, and craftsmen year after year, created a financial drain unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. And the pyramids were not one-time expenses. Each pharaoh wanted to outdo his predecessor. Khufu's Great Pyramid was followed by Khafre's Pyramid and his massive stone sphinx, and then Menkaure's Pyramid with its complex of smaller temples and satellite pyramids. Each new ruler escalated the arms race of stone. Imagine if every US president tried to build a skyscraper bigger than the last one as their legacy project. That's essentially what the pharaohs were doing. The resources required kept compounding, while the benefits remained purely symbolic. Worse still, the pyramids demanded ongoing investment long after they were built. Each pyramid was surrounded by mortuary temples that required priests, offerings, and rituals to keep the king's spirit nourished in the afterlife. That meant dedicating land, labor, and wealth forever to feed dead kings. Imagine a tax system where a large chunk of your national budget is permanently tied up feeding ghosts. Over time, more and more of Egypt's agricultural surplus was siphoned off into maintaining these giant stone tombs rather than supporting the living population. This extravagant spending might have been manageable if Egypt's wealth had continued to grow, but the strain of building projects this massive stretched Egypt's economy to the breaking point. By the end of the Old Kingdom, droughts and low Nile floods worsened the situation. Without bumper harvests to keep the food supply steady, the state could no longer afford to keep funneling resources into construction and maintenance. The centralized government weakened. Local governors, known as nomarchs, grew more powerful, and the once unified Old Kingdom fragmented into chaos. The so-called First Intermediate Period followed a century of political collapse, famine, and regional conflict. And what was the reward for all this sacrifice? The pyramids did achieve their goal of lasting forever, but only as giant stone relics. The pharaohs who built them gained eternal monuments, but their descendants inherited empty coffers, weakened authority, and a fractured state. The Old Kingdom's obsession with leaving behind the biggest tomb possible left the living population starving and the government powerless. It's the ultimate case of vanity projects gone wrong. To put this in perspective, think about modern infrastructure spending. Governments today can collapse under the weight of debt from highways, bridges, or prestige projects like Olympic Games. Now, imagine those costs multiplied by tens of thousands of workers over decades, with no return on investment except a giant triangle in the desert. That's the situation Egypt found itself in. Every block of stone stacked was another pound of grain diverted, another field untended, another debt racked up against the future. Some historians argue that pyramid building was a form of social control. Keeping the population busy with massive state projects maintained order and kept unrest in check. That may be true, but it also locked Egypt into a cycle of wasteful expenditure. Once pyramid building became the standard for royal legitimacy, no pharaoh could back out without looking weak or unworthy. This pyramid race was a trap of their own making, one that consumed Egypt's strength until there was nothing left to give. The collapse of the Old Kingdom shows that even the mightiest rulers can escape the consequences of bad financial planning. Building pyramids was like taking out a massive mortgage with no income to pay it back. Each pharaoh gambled that Egypt's prosperity would last forever. But nature, economics, and human ambition proved otherwise. What survives today is stunning architecture and a cautionary tale. The grandeur of the pyramids hides the fact that they were tombs, not only for kings, but for an entire era of Egyptian stability. And that asks the dumbest part of this decision. The pharaohs thought they were building eternal symbols of strength. But what they actually built were monuments to their own failure to balance ambition with reality. The Old Kingdom's obsession with pyramid construction became the very reason it collapsed. If you found this story about the world's most expensive tombs fascinating, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more tales of history as biggest blunders and the surprising lessons they leave behind. Picture for a moment the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the largest stone structure ever built by human hands. It rises more than 450 feet above the desert, with over 2 million individual stone blocks stacked in perfect alignment. It is a marvel, even today. But what gets forgotten in the admiration is the staggering cost behind it. Each one of those stone blocks was quarried, cut, hauled, dragged, and set in place. And every single step of that process demanded resources. What looks like a timeless symbol of power was, in reality, an economic black hole that swallowed Egypt's wealth for generations. The pharaohs weren't just building tombs, they were piling debt on their kingdom brick by brick. The scale of these projects required the invention of an entire construction economy. First came the quarries. Massive amounts of limestone were pulled from quarries near Giza, but not all of the stone was local. The hardest granite, needed for inner chambers and passages, came from Aswan, hundreds of miles of river. Transporting multi-ton granite blocks along the Nile required fleets of specially built boats, docking facilities, and laborers who knew how to handle such enormous loads. And the tools to cut that stone, mostly copper chisels, wore down constantly. This meant that thousands of chisels had to be replaced regularly, which meant massive smelting operations, miners to gather the copper, and artisans to forge the tools. When you look at a pyramid, you not just looking at stone, you looking at an entire supply chain stretched across Egypt, and every link in that chain had a cost. Then came the infrastructure. Roads had to be built to haul stones from quarries to the construction site. Ramps made of mud brick, stone, and rubble had to be raised and constantly extended as the pyramid grew higher. These ramps were themselves massive projects, requiring continuous repair and replacement. After they served their purpose, most of them had to be dismantled, which meant more labor and more wasted resources. The pyramids were not just one monument, but dozens of smaller projects orbiting them: quarries, roads, ramps, work camps, storage facilities, bakeries, breweries, and tomb complexes for the officials who supervised construction. The workforce was not a temporary draft either. Over time, pyramid construction shifted from seasonal farmers working during the Nile flood to a permanent, specialized workforce. Skilled stonecutters, architects, engineers, scribes, boat builders, and craftsmen lived and worked year-round. Archaeological digs near Giza have uncovered entire worker villages, complete with bakeries that could mass-produce thousands of loaves of bread a day, breweries churning out vats of beer, and even medical facilities to care for injured laborers. Feeding this workforce was an enormous drain. Grain had to be collected and redistributed. Cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered regularly to provide meat, and everything required storage, transport, and accounting. This wasn't just labor, it was a parallel economy devoted entirely to pyramid building. The sheer permanence of this system created a problem. Once the state invested in specialized workers, it couldn't easily turn back. A farmer could return to his field after a season of hauling stones, but a stonemason or a copper smelter relied on constant demand for his skills. If pyramid building slowed down, these people were out of work, which meant unrest, so the state kept commissioning more and more projects. Not because they were needed, but because the system they created demanded it. Egypt became locked into a cycle of construction spending, like a government addicted to funding massive public works it could no longer afford. Every pharaoh wanted his own pyramid, his own statement of divine authority, and each new ruler pushed the system harder. The Great Pyramid of Khufu dwarfed the structures of his predecessors, but Kafir, his son, built a pyramid nearly as large, plus the Great Sphinx to guard it. Menkaure, though forced to scale back, still constructed an elaborate complex of smaller pyramids and temples. This arms race of stone was devastating. Egypt wasn't spending its surplus on trade, innovation, or strengthening its military. It was sinking it all into bigger tombs. Imagine if every American president decided their legacy depended on building a tower taller than the last one, regardless of cost. That is essentially what happened in the Old Kingdom, and the nation's economy was slowly crushed under the weight. What made this worse was the eternal upkeep. A pyramid was never truly finished. Once completed, priests and workers were tied permanently to the mortuary complex, performing rituals and supplying offerings of food, drink, and incense to sustain the king's spirit in the afterlife. To support this, the state set aside land and resources that would forever be diverted away from the living. Farms, estates, and villages were dedicated to feeding the dead pharaoh, creating a permanent drain on the economy. Over time, the more pyramids there were, the more land and labor were locked into these cults of the dead. Instead of feeding the population or bolstering trade, wealth was trapped in rituals that gave nothing back to the state. The pyramid system also bred corruption and resentment. Local governors, or namarchs, were tasked with collecting resources and labor for these projects. As the demands grew heavier, these officials gained more power in managing their regions. The central government weakened as more authority slipped into local hands. Some nomarchs began diverting resources for their own purposes or building monuments for themselves. The central authority that had once made pyramid building possible was hollowed out by the very system it created. The state had overextended itself, and cracks began to show. Add to this the unpredictable Nile. Egypt's prosperity always depended on good floods to water the fields. During years of strong floods, the state could scrape together enough grain to fund pyramid projects and still feed the people. But when the floods were low, harvests fell short, and suddenly there was not enough food to cover both the workers on the pyramids and the rest of the population. The government couldn't stop pyramid building without looking weak, but it also couldn't keep feeding everyone. This balancing act became impossible. By the time the Old Kingdom drew to its end, the pyramid system had exhausted Egypt's resources and destabilized its society. The monuments at Giza, so impressive to us today, were in their own time symbols of a nation stretched to its limits. The pharaohs built them to show strength, but what they really showed was recklessness. The Great Pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a debt that lasted for generations. The economy was bent entirely toward feeding an endless appetite for stone. And when the food ran short, the state collapsed under its own weight. This is the tragedy behind the wonder. The pyramids stand as a breathtaking testament to human ambition, but they also reveal the cost of unchecked vanity. What was once a vibrant, wealthy state became trapped in a single-minded pursuit of building monuments it could not afford to maintain. Egypt literally mortgaged its future to stack stone in the desert. And when the bills came due, the dynasty of pyramid builders crumbled. This was a nation built not just on bricks, but on debt so large it could never be repaid. And it buried an entire kingdom along with its kings. When we look at the pyramids today, it's easy to think of them as finished products, great tombs that demanded a huge effort, but once completed, they stood silently for eternity. The reality was very different. The pyramid wasn't the end of spending, it was the beginning of an endless bill. Each pyramid was the centerpiece of a sprawling mortuary complex, and that complex needed to be kept alive forever, at least in theory. Priests, scribes, servants, cooks, and guards were assigned to make sure that the pharaoh's spirit was fed, clothed, and honored for eternity. In practice, this meant building up vast religious estates that operated almost like the pharaoh's retirement fund, except this fund didn't just run out of money. It ran the country out of money. The system worked like this. When a pyramid was completed, the king set aside farmland, herds of livestock, workshops, and villages to support the rituals that would sustain his spirit. These estates were tax-exempt, meaning the resources they produced were not available for the state's treasury. Grain harvested from those fields didn't feed soldiers, didn't build canals, and didn't prepare for famine. It went straight into offerings and into the mouths of priests. Livestock was slaughtered, not for the living population, but as part of the daily rituals for the dead. Over time, more and more of Egypt's wealth was siphoned into these mortuary estates. The bigger the pyramid, the bigger the cult that had to serve it, and the more resources were permanently locked away. Consider how this played out at Giza. The Great Pyramid wasn't just a giant pile of stone. It was surrounded by temples, smaller pyramids, storage facilities, and entire living quarters for priests and workers who stayed there for generations after Khufu's death. Archaeological evidence shows an entire community dedicated to this purpose. Every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every piece of linen, and every chunk of incense that passed through those temples was part of a permanent tax diversion. Multiply that by not just Khufu's pyramid, but also those of Kafir and Menkaure, and you get a massive section of Egypt's economy trapped in feeding the cults of 3 dead kings. Now imagine the effect as the generations went on. Every pharaoh wanted his own mortuary complex, which meant another permanent drain. These weren't short-term costs. They lasted as long as the priests kept performing the rituals. Even if later kings tried to cut corners, they still had to keep some level of funding in place. Otherwise, they risked angering both the gods and the powerful priesthood that controlled these estates. It was like a snowball rolling downhill. The more pyramids there were, the more of Egypt's economy was locked into keeping its dead rulers comfortable in the afterlife. The consequences for the central government were devastating. Egypt's strength had always depended on its ability to control and redistribute resources from the Nile floods. With the mortuary estates taking up more and more of the harvest, the state had less to spend on essential functions. Canal maintenance suffered, which in turn reduced agricultural productivity. When a bad flood came, the government no longer had reserves to cover the shortfall, and famine could sweep through the land. The bureaucracy, once a finely tuned machine that ensured Egypt's survival, became starved of funds. This weakening of the central government opened the door for local governors, or nomarchs, to step in. Because the king could no longer reliably feed the people during lean years, local leaders took on greater responsibility, gaining more loyalty from their regions. In effect, the wealth trapped in mortuary cults not only drained the treasury, but also eroded the very authority of the pharaohs. Egypt became a patchwork of semi-independent territories, each run by local elites who had more practical power than the king himself. And it wasn't just about food. Think of the manpower wasted. Skilled workers and farmers were attached to mortuary estates, producing goods and services that fed rituals instead of building up the economy. Boats that could have been trading up and down the Nile were instead ferrying supplies to temple granaries. Workshops that might have created tools for farming or military campaigns were making luxury goods for offerings. The very engine of Egypt's productivity was misdirected into sustaining the dead at the expense of the living. Over time, this imbalance created widespread strain. The people saw their labor and their harvests consumed by rituals that gave them nothing in return. Resentment grew, especially when the state could not provide relief in times of need. The priests who managed these estates gained immense wealth and influence, often rivaling the power of the pharaoh. What began as a way to honor the king in death turned into a parasitic system that sapped the kingdom, its vitality, and fractured its unity. The pyramids, then, were not just monuments to kings, they were monuments to a broken economic model. The idea that a ruler-esque afterlife required eternal maintenance locked Egypt into a system it couldn't escape. Every loaf of bread placed at an altar was one less loaf for a hungry family during famine. Every tax-exempt field that fed a mortuary priest was one less field supporting the army or repairing the canals. Egypt had effectively mortgaged its future to pay for its past. By the later Old Kingdom, the costs had spiraled so far out of control that the system could no longer sustain itself. The government had less money to spend on public works, less food to distribute, and less authority to command loyalty. The once mighty pharaohs became figureheads as local leaders rose in power. And all the while, the pyramids still loomed over the desert, not as symbols of enduring strength, but as reminders of an economic mistake carved into stone. The pyramids looked eternal, but the system that supported them was not. Egypt had turned its kings' tombs into permanent financial black holes, draining away the lifeblood of the nation. What was supposed to guarantee eternal life for the pharaohs instead guaranteed hardship for their people. In the end, the so-called retirement funds of the dead kings bankrupted the living, pushing the old kingdom toward collapse. This was not just vanity, it was a national tragedy written in stone and debt. The pyramids didn't just drain Egypt's treasury through endless labor and supplies, they also created a new dangerous problem, the unchecked rise of the priesthood to maintain the sprawling mortuary cults of the dead kings. Pharaohs began giving away some of their most valuable assets, fertile farmland, villages, and entire estates to the temples. On the surface, this may have seemed like an efficient solution. Instead of the central government directly managing offerings and rituals, priests were handed the resources to do it themselves. But in practice, this was a catastrophic surrender of wealth and power that chipped away at the very foundation of the pharaoh's rule. Think about what this meant. The Nile floodplain was the beating heart of Egypt's economy. Every year, the river deposited rich black silt, creating some of the most productive farmland in the ancient world. Whoever controlled that land controlled the food supply, the taxes, and ultimately, the people. When the pharaohs handed over these lands to the priesthood, they weren't just giving away fields, they were giving away control. The grain from those estates no longer filled the royal granaries. Instead, it went directly to the temples, bypassing the state entirely. The priesthood quickly became one of the largest landholders in Egypt, and with land came power. Priests grew independently wealthy, not because they earned it through conquest or administration, but because the king had given it to them as a permanent privilege. These lands were tax-exempt, which meant the crown couldn't even skim off a portion to support state projects. Over time, more and more of the kingdom's surplus was siphoned into temple coffers. What had once been the lifeblood of the monarchy now fed an entirely separate power structure. Imagine being a farmer on one of these temple estates. Your harvest no longer went to the state to build canals or support the army. Instead, it was destined for offerings to a dead king or to feed a priestly class that lived off divine service. If famine struck, the central government had fewer reserves to help, because much of the harvest was tied up in religious lands that didn't answer to the crown. The priests could choose how to distribute their wealth, and their loyalty to the living pharaoh was never guaranteed. This created a subtle but dangerous shift in the balance of power. The pharaoh, once the unquestioned center of Egypt's political and religious life, began to share the stage with a priesthood that held real material influence. The more the kings gave away to sustain their pyramid cults, the more they empowered these priests, who became not just spiritual leaders, but economic magnates. In effect, the state funded its own competition. The consequences stretched far beyond economics. With land and wealth came political clout. Priests began to act as power brokers, aligning with local nobles who also benefited from the weakening of central authority. Pharaohs, who had once ruled with absolute dominance, now had to contend with a growing network of elites who controlled resources the crown could no longer touch. This was especially dangerous because Egypt's stability had always depended on strong, centralized rule. When the pharaoh's grip loosened, the entire system risked unraveling. We can see this playing out during the late Old Kingdom as the priesthood gained power. Local governors' namarchs took advantage of the weakening monarchy to expand their own authority. Without a strong central treasury, the pharaoh could not enforce loyalty as effectively, nor could he outspend rivals. What had once been a united kingdom under a god king was sliding into a fractured landscape where temples and nobles wielded independent authority. The grand pyramids still towered over the horizon, but behind the facade of eternal strength, Egypt was hollowing out. And the irony is hard to miss. The pyramids were built to ensure the pharaoh's eternal power and divine status. But by tying their afterlife to permanent economic drains, the kings ensured that their descendants would have less and less real authority. The priests who maintained the mortuary rituals were supposed to serve the memory of the dead rulers, but in practice, they were bleeding the living kingdom dry. It was as though the pyramids were feeding off the state that had built them, growing stronger as the government grew weaker. Even ordinary people would have noticed the shift. The fields they worked, the grain they grew, and the taxes they once owed to the king now went to the temples. When they looked for relief in times of famine, the state's hand was empty. Yet the offerings to the dead never stopped, even as the living went hungry. To many, this must have seemed like a betrayal of the social contract that had bound Egypt together for centuries. The pharaoh was no longer the supreme provider. He had given that role away. Over generations, this decision to give land to the temples created a permanent imbalance. Once the priesthood held land, it was nearly impossible to claw it back. No king wanted to risk angering the gods or their earthly representatives, and the priests made sure of that. They became untouchable, shielded by divine authority and immense wealth. In some ways, the temples became states within a state, operating with their own resources, staff, and political agendas. This decentralization eroded Egypt's unity. A kingdom that had once been a model of centralized administration and monumental power became a patchwork of competing interests. The pharaoh's grand building projects left behind impressive monuments, but they also created the conditions for fragmentation and decline. The priests, who were supposed to honor the kings in death, ended up undermining their descendants in life. What had begun as a strategy to maintain divine rituals turned into a massive mistake. By giving away the farm literally, the pharaohs traded their kingdom's future for their own eternal comfort. It was a dumb decision of staggering proportions. A ruler meant to embody absolute authority had willingly handed away the very resources that made him powerful. The pyramids still stood, but the throne that built them was growing weaker with each acre signed over to the priests. The old kingdom of Egypt is remembered for its breathtaking monuments, towering pyramids, and the seemingly unshakable rule of its pharaohs. But behind the polished limestone blocks and the grandeur of royal tombs was a financial system cracking under the weight of impossible demands. What the pyramids represent today as symbols of eternal power. In their own time, they marked the beginning of Egypt's financial ruin. The relentless building programs, the massive drain of resources, and the decision to hand land and wealth to temples set Egypt on a path it could not sustain. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the centralized government that had once controlled every aspect of life along the Nile had collapsed, leaving the country fractured and weakened. To understand how this happened, we need to picture Egypt's economy during the height of pyramid construction. Unlike modern nations, ancient Egypt had no coinage, no banks, and no abstract financial systems. Wealth came directly from the land, in the form of grain harvested from the fertile floodplains of the Nile. That grain not only fed the population, but also paid workers, supported armies, and stocked the state's reserves. Everything hinged on agricultural surplus, and in good years, the pharaohs had enough to fund ambitious projects. But the pyramids were not one-time expenses. They were decades-long drains that demanded constant streams of labor, supplies, and food. Even while normal state functions, defense, irrigation, administrations still needed resources. The cost of building a pyramid was staggering. Stone had to be quarried, transported, and shaped. Workers had to be fed year-round, housed, and organized into permanent teams. Specialized craftsmen built boats, copper tools, and transport sledges. Infrastructure projects like roads, canals, and ramps had to be constantly repaired. None of this was optional. Once construction began, it could not stop, or the pharaoh risked leaving behind an incomplete tomb that would doom his afterlife. Every pyramid then became a kind of financial black hole, sucking in resources from every corner of the kingdom. And even when a pyramid was finished, the expenses didn't end. The mortuary cults established to honor the dead pharaoh required permanent estates to fund rituals for eternity. Priests were given land and workers to ensure that offerings never ceased, meaning that every pyramid created a permanent financial burden. Multiply this across multiple reigns, and you can see the pattern. The more pyramids Egypt built, the more it strangled its own future. At first, Egypt seemed strong enough to handle this. The Nile provided, the surplus flowed, and the monuments rose. But cracks began to show. Years of poor flooding or crop failure could push the system into crisis, especially when much of the surplus was tied up in temple estates that the state could no longer control. The pharaohs had locked themselves into a system where they couldn't scale back. Once one king built a great pyramid, his successors felt obligated to match or outdo him, even if the treasury was gasping for air. This cycle of competitive monument building was as much about ego as religion, and it drained the state dry. The financial strain had political consequences too, with more land and wealth in the hands of the priesthood, and more local nobles gaining power. While the central state weakened, the pharaoh's grip on the country loosened. Governors in distant provinces began to act independently, maintaining their own resources rather than funneling them to the crown. The king's ability to project authority shrank as his wealth shrank. The aura of divine kingship, once unchallenged, now had to contend with the reality of an empty treasury and growing rivals. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the system collapsed under its own weight. Egypt slid into what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation, famine, and disorder. The once mighty central government disintegrated, replaced by local rulers who looked after their own regions. Without the steady hand of a wealthy and powerful pharaoh, Egypt lost the unity that had defined it for centuries. It's no coincidence that this collapse followed the most ambitious phase of pyramid construction. The monuments still stood, dazzling to behold, but the state that built them had bankrupted itself into oblivion. The irony is sharp. The pyramids were built as eternal symbols of pharaonic power, designed to project strength and stability for all time. And yet, in their very construction, they revealed the weakness of the system. They were too expensive, too demanding, and too permanent a drain on resources to be sustainable. Instead of guaranteeing eternal glory, they accelerated decline. The pharaoh's obsession with their afterlife robbed their descendants of stability in this life. What's perhaps most striking is how clear the lesson is, even thousands of years later. Monumental projects that overreach a state's capacity can undermine the very institutions they are meant to glorify. The Old Kingdom pharaohs may have believed they were building symbols of immortality, but what they really left behind was a cautionary tale of ambition outpacing resources. Their dynasty fell into chaos, not because of foreign invasion, but because of their own choices, the dumb decision to bankrupt their country in pursuit of eternal stone triangles. And that's where this story comes full circle. When we stand today in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, we see a wonder of the ancient world. But for the people of the Old Kingdom, it was the beginning of an age of ruin, a monument that outlived the very system that made it possible. The pyramids are breathtaking, but they are also the clearest example of how financial overreach can destroy even the most powerful of empires. If you enjoyed this dive into the dumbest decisions in history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historians so you don't miss the next story.